Welcome to the April edition of our 2026 series of Down to Earth webinars. These will cover a broad range of subjects and are available afterwards on our YouTube channel alongside our previous talks. Our talk today will be given by Mark Hinsley from our geotechnical team, providing an update on the design and specification of Earthworks following the updates to guidance documents. But firstly, a brief note on housekeeping during the talk. All attendees' microphones are automatically muted throughout the webinar. During the presentation, you can post questions online and there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the talk. Those that can't be answered due to time constraints will be answered after the webinar. Shortly after the webinar, you'll receive a link to a short survey. If you can take a few minutes to provide feedback, please, so we can improve on future webinars. Now, please let me introduce our speaker today. Mark Hinsley is an Associate Director in our geotechnical team. He has a wide experience in the geotechnical assessment of soils and development of brownfield land for development. Mark has over 30 years experience in both remediation design and validation and managing complex projects both on-site and office-based. Through his hands-on experience of complex contaminated sites, Mark has a detailed knowledge of the practicalities of earthworks, design and validation. So we'll now turn our cameras off and I'll hand over to Mark, who will guide us through the updates to the Earthworks guidance documents.
So just going to switch my camera off so you can see it kind of full screen. To current slide. Okay. Right. Well, thank you, Hugh, and welcome everybody, and thank you for attending the presentation. So, specification for highway works, Series 600, was originally written about the time I started working over 30 years ago, and whilst intended for highways use, it has become pretty much the generic earthworks specification used in the UK. And used for a wide variety of projects beyond simple highways. Over the years, it has been revised, and the last previous revision took place in 2016, and it's been kind of augmented with the addition of the design manual for roads and bridges. However, a more substantial revision has recently been undertaken between 2020 and 2025, culminating in a revised version being issued in September 2025. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And it does require a little bit of prior knowledge of the previous Series 600 document, and I'll be comparing against that. But first, a bit of context. The specification for highway works is part of a larger suite of documents. The Manual of Contract Documents for Highway Works, which was originally produced in 7 volumes, numbered 0 to 6, and augmented with the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges, the DMRB. The recent changes have consolidated these down into 4 documents. The specification for highway works, the information for specifiers, and the method of measurement for highway works, and the design manual for roads and bridges has been updated. National specific versions have been created for all the countries of the UK and can be downloaded free from the Standards for Highway website, as can all the documents that I'm going to refer to in the talk today. Now, these changes create 4 different roles within the Manual of Contract Documents for Highway Works. There's the overseeing organisation, usually a highways body, if it's used for its original purpose, who will provide the necessary standards and guidance to work to. There is the designer, who creates the design and gathers all the necessary design information and passes that to the specifier, He uses that information to specify the works by populating the work-specific requirements. A series of tables which summarize all the key information to be used within the completed specification. And then the completed specification is used by the constructor to implement the works and deliver the project. And then he is required at the end of the works to provide as-built documentation as required by the specification and the work-specific requirements within it. And this structure applies to all the series within the Manual of Contract Documents for Highway Works. The specific documents that I've shown in the flow diagram are those that relate to Earthworks. But there's similar documents for each series within the wider documents. So it's a common structure across the board. So in addition to these new documents and the new combined specification for highway works, information for specifiers, there have been changes to the DMRB, which has substantially stayed the same. These are involved changes to CD 622, managing geotechnical risk. Basically, that's now updated to include a specific section on design outputs, a key part of the new structure. There's a requirement to use the ICE specification for ground investigation. The old contract documents under the specification for highway works for ground investigation have been removed, and there's now reliance on the ICE document. And there's been a revised section on trenchless excavation added as well. There's been some minor changes to related documents, generally relating to buried structures, but these only apply to figures. And then finally, there's been a new document created, a new guidance document, CD 601, Design of Earthworks, which specifically relates to the design outputs that are going to be needed by the specifier to populate the work-specific requirements, which we'll discuss a little later. Now, originally, Series 600 just applied to Earthworks, but the new series has been expanded into almost what I call a ground suite, and basically includes a series of other related areas, which are listed in the table here. So basically everything relating to the ground now has a 6 prefix. And they've been taken from various other areas within the previous documents. So now moving on to the Earthworks series and the specifics of that. This new document, CD 601, which harmonizes with the design manual for roads and bridges, and provides the additional kind of information and detail that are required for these design outputs to populate the work-specific requirements, which we'll discuss a bit later. The terminology has been updated, so it has all this new modern jargon in it. Design outputs and WSRs, etc., are in there, and it details exactly what's required. So to inform your SIs and everything like that, which will be required to get that information. And design outputs are really any information required to fill out the work-specific requirement templates. They're prescribed within the design manual for roads and bridges for minor projects and very simple specifications. But for other projects, you will need to do a fair bit of work to populate them. They do focus on highway specific requirements. And that's one thing we often forget, is actually this isn't designed as a general earthworks specification. It is designed specifically for highways. So it doesn't necessarily cover all earthworks activities. And there may be other guidance documents that you'll need to refer to perhaps maybe NHBC chapter 4.6, etc., for guidance to inform your work specific requirements. And finally, the Earthworks design outputs need to be included within your geotechnical design report required under CD 622. So what are the big and sort of principal changes, which we'll kind of notice as we go through the document? There's a new format, and there's a more logical chapter structure and grouping of the old clauses within Series 600. Each specific requirement and clause and subclause of the original document has been gone through, it's been reviewed, vague and subjective terms, reasonable, etc., have been removed. So there's much greater clarity, it's far cleaner language, and it's much more concise. So there's much greater clarity with the document. Anything relating to design and advice has been taken out and has been placed in the design documents, or the information for specifiers, who are the people who need it. And that's been taken out of the actual specification that the contractors got to work to. So a good deal less woolly from that point of view as well. There's been much greater deep emphasis on verification documentation, and that's included with the work that you're verifying, rather than being effectively a table at the end, which it was in the old document, really table kind of 6, 7. It's now handled within kind of each section. There's the introduction of these earthwork construction procedure documents, which are required for complex works, and we'll talk a bit more about those a little later. The testing frequency. This was a bit of an odd one before because it wasn't within Series 600, it was included within Series 100, the general series within the old setup, particularly within Table 1.5. And it was separate from the actual tests that it was referring to, which were in Series 600. They're now all combined in Series 601, and the frequency is bundled in with the actual tests that it's referring to. Clean and otherwise acceptable material can now be specified as U1A, unacceptable or unsuitable material if there's a surplus of it, and it can be subjected to processing and so on, maybe to render it as a different material that can be used in the works, or it can then be kind of or disposed of off-site. So mentioned earlier, 1.5 and Table 6.1 have been combined, and they've been replaced with specific work-specific requirement tables for each class of material. Again, we'll discuss those a little bit more later. Requirements for pavement foundations and capping materials, etc. They've been taken out of the Earthworks series, and they're now in Series 201, which is pavement foundations, which is probably where they should be. Continuous compaction control has been introduced. Again, we'll cover this in a bit more detail later, but really recognises what's being done out in the field anyway. We rarely now totally rely on method compaction to deliver the results we want. We're usually looking for some greater degree of control and surety that the works are going to deliver what they're meant to at the end, rather than having a big contractual dispute. And finally, the, I suppose, specialist works, most of which relate to embankments, cuttings and slopes, such as strengthened earthworks, reinforced earth, gabions, etc. They're now grouped in their own chapter, chapter 13, altogether. So those are the big issues, and we'll now go on to explore kind of some of the particular issues with each of the different sections. And first of all, we'll look at structure. So there's now it's now divided into 15 chapters rather than the separate, I think was it 40 odd clauses that existed before. There's a new sort of chapter on general information, which covers a lot of the material in Series 100. And what I'm going to talk about today is those items indicated in green. There's 15 chapters, but those really beyond 7 are really related to specialist activities, which won't occur on most jobs, or maybe one of them could at will. What I'm going to focus on today is the ones that affect bulk earthworks, the majority of the work that most of us do. And those are the ones that are highlighted in green, the first 7 that you can see there. And then also touch briefly on specific installation requirements, which covers unusual, sort of difficult materials, coarse materials, chalk, etc. And for each section, as we go through it, I'll just point out, it was also pointed out in blue, is the old structure and the old references of where kind of information was. And in a lot of cases, the technical substance hasn't altered, it's just being grouped differently within the new document. Okay, so this is moving now into the kind of the new structure and the specialist clauses, which I won't be talking about today, but I'll briefly kind of run through them. Treatment of voids and mine workings is a separate kind of area. Ground improvement as well may be covered by the work-specific requirements within that, or may require an ECPD. Again, we'll talk about what that is later. Earthworks around structures, the special geotechnical works we referred to earlier relating to slopes and slope stability and rectifying it, and then instrumentation and monitoring of earthworks and sampling of test methods, which generally refers to the methods and standards that are used for each particular test that you may be referring to within your works. So moving on to the general item. Again, this wasn't really in Series 600 originally. It was formerly part of Series 100, where it was included with really all the general project information. And what this requires now is that all the information that is specific to earthworks or related to earthworks is included within this section and the work-specific requirement. So all the drawings, models, any design reports, requirements for method statements, any technical approvals that have got to be applied for from the contractor and contractor design, and any other documents and requirements which are relevant. So it may well refer to the Construction Environmental Management Plan, for example, or the MMP, or kind of other kind of documents which may relate to your earthworks. So again, it covered before, but it's a bit neater now, and it's actually within Series 600. I've mentioned several times already EPCD or ECPDs rather than EPCDs on the top there. Earthworks construction procedure documents. Now, the work standard requirements, as we'll see later on in the talk, are very much simplistic tables where you fill in each kind of field of the table to generate your requirement. Not every design can be covered in that form. You know, some designs are considerably more complex, require more explanation, or they're variable. What you do if X happens and so on. It's difficult to convey that within a work-specific requirement table. And so earthwork construction procedure documents are required to cover those designs and provide the extra detail. So there are supplementary documents which will support the specification and the work-specific requirements. And there's guidance of them, how they're prepared in the CD 601, the guidance document, and they need to be included within the geotechnical design report. They could be required for kind of various activities, really anything that might require a flow diagram, or what you do if this happens or that happens, etc. That's where your earthwork construction procedure document will come in. This it gives you a kind of your initial introduction to your first work-specific requirements table, of which there are hordes throughout the document, usually several of these tables per section. And this really just shows the general format. There's usually some form of unique reference at the beginning there, which applies only to that item and that line. It may then refer to your earthwork type, could be an embankment, cutting, general fill, or something like that. The relevant drawing in this case that will apply to it, the drawing reference, the BIM detail, and then some form of descriptor in terms of what that actually refers to. Yes, you'll find most BIM numbers are almost totally unintelligible, so you do need something like that. And in each case, the specifier is provided with guidance, which we can see here at the bottom, which tells him exactly what he needs to put into each section of the table. So it's very clear, it's very obvious what he needs to do and what he needs to fill in, and all of these entries need to be completed. And this is pretty much standard in various forms. Obviously, the descriptors at the top change for all the areas of the CC 601 and CP 601, the guidance document. So, kind of moving on to kind of the second chapter, which is earthwork materials, and this first chapter, number 2, really covers what was in the old clause 601. So it's basically, what are your acceptable materials? What are your unacceptable materials? And it also includes now a little bit more emphasis on processing, what you might do to render unacceptable materials into acceptable materials and keep them on site. There have been a few changes in terms of the original clause 601. Included a lot of definitions. These have all been stripped out. They're now either within the CD 601 or the instruction to specifiers. They're no longer kind of in this section. And also, as I mentioned earlier, unacceptable classes can now include surplus acceptable material. It will usually go into U1A unless there's a very pressing reason. Once we've decided kind of which materials are acceptable, it then goes on to provide into the detail of the acceptable earthworks classes. Again, it pretty much follows the old kind of system. Permitted constituents. Table 6.1 has been replaced with a new table 3.4, which just describes the classes. So you still have a class 1A, a well-graded granular material. It's exactly the same kind of description as you had before, and it's the same gradings and everything else, although they're just presented now in different tables. Likewise, the restrictions about where you can place materials that used to be in table 6.3 are still reflected. There's testing frequency and criteria has been taken now from appendix and table 1.5 and is now included within series 600, and it is specified along with the test that it's referring to the frequency of. Much greater emphasis now on chemical testing in the document as well. That's sort of like a standard requirement. It wasn't really before in the old one. And there's also a distinction between suitability and verification testing. So suitability testing really is your initial classification, maybe the information you get from a supplier in terms of imported material that you're bringing into site, any check testing that you might do before he does bring it in. information from your site investigation upon which you initially classified material, decided it's suitable for this use and class, and it can go in this part of the site. And then your verification testing is when you're checking that that actually does conform to that original suitability assessment, and that it has been placed, compacted properly once it's gone in. And so that sort of distinction has been kind of added in, and much greater emphasis on record keeping and recording your test results, how they're recorded, kind of where they're recorded. Again, that's all specified within work-specific requirements. There are a few slight differences. One is that uniformity coefficient is not given. Obviously, one of the granular classes, class 1B, which is a uniform granular material, which can be a fine, something like a sand or a pea gravel, something similar. Usually, you assess that it's the same by applying a uniformity coefficient to it, and usually it has to be have a coefficient of 10 or less. That's not now kind of specified anywhere or mentioned anywhere, and it needs to be specified within the work-specific requirements. Of course, you don't need to use 10 necessarily. You can have maybe slightly higher coefficient if you want to, and want to have a little bit more range. So there's a bit of freedom to within that particular class. As I mentioned earlier, everything really relating to pavement formations and foundations, subformation, etc., has been removed. Whether that refers to stabilized formations with lime or cement. In some of the class 7 materials before that's done, and class 9 once it's been applied, that's all been taken out. And likewise capping materials. So you won't find your old 6F grades in the new document at all. 6F2, beloved by demolition contractors, what they crush down to, isn't in there. It's now in the pavement series. And similarly, some classes have been subdivided really to just those relating to buried structures, and they're included with a bit more detail. As I mentioned, there's been some changes to the tables and how the information is presented. The information in the tables hasn't changed. The gradings are the same. They're just presented in a different format. So table 6.2 is gone. It's now replaced by table 3.10a. And rather than a matrix form, it's in individual entries which just refer to the particle size is referred to in that grading. But as you can see here, the actual grading percentages haven't altered. The materials are exactly the same as they were before, just presented in a different fashion. That's the same with table 6.5 in terms of imported aggregates and specialist grades of material. There is a slight difference here, and this initially threw me when I kind of looked at it and thought, well, what's a non-aggregate? Aren't they all gravels and they're kind of made of minerals, etc.? Well, it actually relates to the standards under which the materials are assessed. Basically, the old way it was presented in table 6.5 is that on the right under aggregates, and that refers to the aggregates that are manufactured or created under the EN aggregate standards. And they use a slightly different sieve size to the BS 1377 sieves that are used for standard soil classification, and which you may well be using on site if you're manufacturing maybe your own aggregates from site 1 material. And as you'll note, you can see there's in the left-hand column, the non-aggregates column, there's no 6.3 millimeter because that sieve's not used. It's only used for in the aggregate standards. Likewise, the aggregate standards don't have a 5 millimeter sieve. So that's really why there's the two columns. They're both describing the same material, but just under slightly different standards and slightly different sieves. But again, no changes really in composition and kind of classes. And again, another illustration of the work-specific requirements. And this just shows the ones really for your kind of replacing kind of table kind of 6.1, 1.5, and 6.2, where for each class of material and for each test and each property that you're doing, you've got to specify those 6 things as the specifier, based on the information you've got from your design reports and your designer. So a lot of individual entries, but very thorough. Now moving on to chapter 4, seems to be a bit of an odds and sods chapter really, and that it's just materials which aren't soils really. And in terms of aggregates, well, yes, they are largely covered in the previous chapter. There's really just a bit of information about the degree of tolerable class X material in terms of, basically dodgy anthropogenic stuff like bits of plastic and other kind of rubbish. How much can you tolerate within your kind of aggregates for your use? There's cross-referencing to the concrete guidance elsewhere within the wider suite of documents, and the work-specific requirements also specify greater detail in respect of your kind of geotextiles, in terms of geometry, physical qualities, tensile strength, etc., and so on. You have to be kind of put into there. Again, you might cover those under an ECPD instead. That's an option. Okay, now moving on to chapter 5, which is a very useful chapter. It's really called General Earthworks Construction, but effectively it covers all the site management items and site kind of operation. Something which was really a bit lacking in the old specification. There were bits and pieces in numerous other clauses, but sort of didn't really cover it as a whole. And this really specifies all the kind of operation of how you handle materials, how you stockpile them, what you do with waste materials, how you protect your earthworks from degradation from the weather, what you do about frozen material, maybe how do what do you do with it once it's thawed, phasing of the work, which particular parts need to be completed before others, how you prepare the site, benching in to either previously prepared fill or natural ground, how you work around obstructions. All these things are covered with their own work-specific requirements, which is very useful because something that I found with writing specifications previously is often you had to cover those things in a sort of separate preamble to the specification because there wasn't really the structure to incorporate it. That's now there within the document. Now moving on to the kind of the meaty one, which is compaction. And again, not a great deal that's new. Maybe a slight change in emphasis within the document. Method compaction is still referred to and is still kind of a method which you can use within it. But there's greater emphasis now on end product compaction and performance control and performance monitoring through testing of the compaction as it's happening, rather than simply relying on method compaction alone. Yeah, and again, that probably just reflects industry practice. Certainly, most clients are unwilling to just trust in the method, that it will deliver kind of what they want. So they want a bit of reassurance that there's not going to be a problem at the end of the job when they kind of finally test it. So it has been allowed for, and associated works that you might need to do to facilitate that, such as compaction trials, again, are now included within the document. There's also detail on the compaction of the formation. Again, there's been some slight changes in the tables. There's now 2 tables covering method compaction, whereas there just used to be 1, 6.4. The new table 6.4, as opposed to SLIC 6/4, just details the method for each class of material. The table 6.5 now provides the actual methods, weight of plant, kind of depth of layer, a number of passes, and so on. So again, all familiar from the old document. Finally, moving on to kind of earthworks formations. Again, a lot more detail on this in terms of actually testing the formation, where you proof rolling, visual observation, your kind of verification of the formation in terms of tests and documentation, and specialist, you're referred to specialist requirements, referring to the road pavements series in places, and likewise the structural series as well. So again, work specific requirements covering all those areas. Again, more emphasis on verification and recording. Finally, moving on to kind of the awkward material. In terms of special requirements for placing certain materials, so particularly coarse grades, class 1C, for example, which has kind of up to 500 millimeters, and class 6B, which is pretty much all cobbles. Those are going to be rolled with specifically heavy plant and pushed out with heavy plant of a minimum weight. The requirements for blinding off layers, etc., are included within that. How you handle chalk, the capacity and weight of the plant, trafficking it, the amount of trafficking it undergoes, are all detailed, and kind of what weather and conditions you can work it in as well, can all be stated within the work specific requirements in section kind of 9. And also similarly, class 4 materials, landscape materials, how those are handled, again, how they're trafficked or not trafficked really, to avoid degrading them, and how heavily or lightly compacted they need to be. So again, work specific requirements cover all those things. So again, very thorough. So finally, to come to a close, and really just go back through and think, well, what really has changed? Well, in terms of the technical substance of the document, and the technical detail, a lot hasn't changed. A lot is still what was in the old document that we've used for years. It's remained the same. What has changed a lot is the style. Much tighter terminology, greater clarity, more concise. The format has altered a lot. Materials being sensibly grouped into different locations than the original kind of clauses. Again, same material, it's just in a different place and in a chapter now, rather than being a separate clause. Extraneous kind of material and it's been removed in relating to kind of design and general advice, and certain sections, particularly those relating really to pavement construction in terms of subformation and capping, have been removed, and they've been placed within the pavement guidance. They're still there, and you could still refer to that particular guidance if you want to use 6F2 or and so on. and bring it in to your own specification. It's less prescriptive. You haven't got to fill out or kind of include all of the old kind of table kind of 6.2 or 1.5 or whatever. You just need to fill in the particular materials that are germane to your piece of work. And there is a bit more freedom for the specifier as to whether you use kind of method compaction or whether you use then product compaction. There's a little bit more freedom to state how you want to do the work. On the kind of negative, on the kind of the other side though, it is less generic. It's more specific to project requirements. You've got to have all the necessary design outputs in place to populate all the tables, and there's quite a lot to populate there. So a bit more work for both the designer and the specifier, but a more thorough and competent job, one would hope, at the end. And as I mentioned kind of earlier, there's greater emphasis on performance, verification, recording, and record keeping than before, and greater emphasis on that rather than simply relying on the method, which is what the original scheme kind of did. So that really brings us to a close, and I look forward to receiving loads of difficult questions now. Really, back over to you, Hugh. I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you, Mark. That was really interesting, and we've had a lot of engagement in terms of questions. You'll be very glad to know. And so I think we'll dive straight into those. I've turned my camera back on. So the first question is from quite early on in your presentation. So you talked about the overseeing organisation in terms of roads and bridges being then a public body. But if the project is private sector project, such as development platform or landfill construction, who would then be the overseeing organisation?
Could well be your client, or it could well be your kind of client's kind of agent in terms of a project kind of manager. Whether they make the decision that you formally follow that guidance, or maybe you as the designer, as we often are, would recommend that it's done to that kind of specification. They'll often just ask you to provide a specification as the designer. So it'll just be up to you to kind of to choose that. And it's possible for one entity to fulfill more than one of those roles. You don't need to have a separate party as the designer. The designer and the specifier can be the same kind of entity. Might be helpful to have them as different individuals within that entity, so you've got a kind of a check across the two. But yes, a particular party can fulfill more than one of the roles that are provided. So.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you for that. Is there, so again, you say that the guidance in terms of the frequency of testing is now looked at by the designer. So in terms of the frequency, would these be specified in line with the superseded guidance in terms of it feels quite free now?
Well, I think it was quite free really before. There's obviously certain areas of guidance, particularly relating to chemical testing, maybe where you're importing topsoil and so on, where you'll be working to certain standards where the local authority, particularly if you're constructing a cover layer on contaminated land, you'll be required by the EHO will be looking for a high degree of testing on that, perhaps to the ALPAG or kind of similar kind of guidance. But kind of how many of your loads, and maybe quite a high kind of frequency. Elsewhere, it's always really been down to the kind of designer and the specifier to detail what degree of testing is appropriate. Okay, there's guidance sort of given, but it's down to really those parties to say what it is. Obviously, they've got their kind of liability insurance and everything to protect. They've got to make sure that it is going to be adequate to do the job. And obviously, it will vary depending upon your source, where you're getting the material, how homogeneous that is. Are you getting material, site one, from a greenfield site where it's reasonably consistent? Or are you dealing with a material which can be quite variable, like colliery spoil, for example, where you may want a higher degree of testing? If you're importing material to site, if you're taking a quarried product, you probably want a lower degree of testing than you would if you're getting a recycled aggregate in. So it is, and really to the existing document, it's down to a large degree to the discretion of the designer and the specifier to specify that degree of testing. And also it depends on literally how much you're going to be using. If you're using kind of hundreds of thousands of cubes from a consistent source, maybe a relatively low kind of frequency. If once you've got enough data to have a statistically kind of acceptable kind of sample. Smaller sites, you might need to do more to get the same higher frequency to get the same level of data. So yeah, a typical consultant answer, it varies really.
Yes. We've had quite a few people ask about, in maybe a slightly panicked way, the disappearance of 6F materials. So someone's asked, would these be now classified under 6N or 6Q or under another regime?
Well, it's possible for granular material to fall under several classes. So a class 6 F2 could be a class 1A. Well, it will fall within the class 1A envelope, which is quite broad. And so it's possible for a material to meet the standards of more than one grading. And also, there is nothing to stop you including your own classes and creating your own classes of materials and kind of using them within your kind of your earthworks. And particularly if you're not working for a highways kind of agency body, and you're doing your own project for an independent client, you're not obliged then to religiously follow what's in the specification. The information on 6F2 and 6F4 and all the other capping grades is still there. It's just not in Series 600 any longer. It's now in the pavement kind of series, because in highways it's generally used to basically improve your formation condition where you've got a low CBR or something like that. Then you've got to make your pavement thickness thicker and put a bit of this granular material down to tighten it up, so that you can actually then put the road pavement kind of on it. So you can still use it, you can still refer to it, and you can specify it yourself. As long as you define it within the work specific requirements. And you may need to put a bit of more definition in to define the grading and everything as well. So it's not gone for good. You can kind of still use it. And that was the case before. I remember working on a particular job where another consultant came up with a particular grade of material called 6X. And basically kind of an earthquake kind of proof kind of granular foundation material, which is an absolute nightmare to place, because there weren't really any standards for how to do it. So so you have got that freedom. You can still do things like that, particularly where you're working kind of outside of the formal kind of highways structure.
In a way, that leads on to another question, which is, does this now open up greater use of recycled aggregates? but I imagine that's down to the suitability of that recycled aggregate and, to an extent, your level of PI insurance.
Yes, yeah. Obviously, with using recycled aggregates, there is the issue of kind of what I call kind of foreign matter. Basically bits of rubbish, wood, etc., that come through. And then the other big issue, which I think is the big concern that we face on a lot of our sites, is obviously most of that material comes from demolition and demolition kind of material, and even though asbestos stripping and asbestos removal has improved over the years, we're still finding in a lot of cases, and it's something to be particularly careful of, where you're importing material, particularly if you're using it within a clean cover layer. It's often you put a layer of gravel, allegedly clean gravel down to act as a marker layer or a hard dig layer between your contaminated material and clean material above. Is that there's often trace or low levels of asbestos fibres within that material, and actually making sure that being careful and to include in your testing, particularly your suitability and verification testing, asbestos as an absolute standard, because it's a common kind of problem. But yes, I think obviously there is greater encouragement within the new document to process materials, to reuse materials, to keep materials on site, and to deal with surplus materials in novel and sustainable ways if you can. And again, that's just in line, I think, with the general way we work now, and we try and minimise kind of any off-site disposal that we can.
Right, fantastic. I'm just conscious of time. I think we'll just wrap up with two quick final questions. So firstly, when do we need to start adopting the new guidance? And is this going to be industry standard for both public and private sector projects?
In terms of when do we need to start using it? Well, I think if you've certainly got a new highways job where you're working for national highways on the trunk road network and so on, then yes, really a new document, you've got to start using the new kind of system kind of now, really. If it's a job that's already gone through kind of planning or the early stages, and you've got an existing specification which is being worked to, very much depends on the attitude of your kind of overseeing body, whether they're comfortable to run with it. Most have been. We've had few requests to actually change existing specifications, unless there's some other reason. I think we've had one where it's a specification that was written in 2014 and obviously wasn't even up to date on the old revision. But for kind of older established jobs, no, it's okay. For smaller kind of projects, estate roads, things like that, and so on, again, it depends upon the local highways as to how keen they are on you using the new guidance. There's nothing wrong with the old guidance. It's just a different way that it's set out. And certainly most local authorities at district level still seem to be accepting specifications under the old document. Sort of intermediate schemes, sort of county kind of level, and so on. Again, it's patchy. It depends upon the individual kind of department. So yes, so for minor jobs, yeah, it's a bit of a period of grace, I think. But I think in time, certainly for anything kind of highways related, yes, it will become the standard. As for other projects, obviously, you're not obliged to use specification for highway works at all. You can use whatever specification you want for other projects which don't have a kind of highways or an adoptable highways kind of element to them. But I think probably it will become in time the default, because I think once you get over the initial problems you have with any change, which is sort of getting the familiarity, and I must admit there's an irritation, but I lived with 30 years with the old document. I know exactly where everything is, and now they've gone and changed it all. Once you get over that initial resistance to change, it is a better document. It is laid out better. It is clearer. It should be easier for the contractor to understand and implement. It is more thorough, includes all the documentation, and technically it's not different from what went before. So I think, yeah, in time it will become kind of adopted. There will be a bit of a grace period for smaller projects, not so much for big national jobs. You have to start get cracking on it now, really.
Okay. Yeah, and that kind of answered my. I'll slip one final question in here then. Someone's asked, what's the difference between suitability and acceptability testing?
I think probably they're both the same, I would say. In that, I think suitability testing, as I read it, is your initial classification, your initial assessment of material that it is suitable to use and bring in, and your verification is then your later checking of that kind of material, that it meets the requirements, it's actually being placed, and it meets the performance requirements that are needed, for the ultimate, the final completed design. So I think probably most acceptability kind of testing kind of will be covered by within
material
suitability,
yeah,
and may also be included to a degree within verification as well. So,
yeah. Okay, so it's a sort of assessing the soil before it's come to site.
Yeah, I think it's more
making sure it's the same soil
question
that's arrived.
Of timing, really,
Yeah.
to a degree, and then I suppose the verification is going to concentrate more on physical qualities in terms of, have you achieved the strength, have you achieved the degree of compaction, which you should have done for that material that you tested in your suitability testing, met a class kind of 1A, fulfilled these gradings, was chemically clean, etc.
Right, I think we will stop the questions there. But thank you so much, Mark. So Mark will answer the other questions when he's had time to gather his thoughts and review the questions. So a massive thank you to Mark for the presentation and for the questions. Our next Down to Earth talk will be on Tuesday, the 12th of May, and we'll be taking a look through the waste legislation and requirements covered by the Streetworks regulations. Please remember to complete the feedback following the presentation, and thank you for attending today, and we'll see you again in May. Thank you.